All right, so today we're gonna do something a little bit different.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. Instead of just kind of looking at current events and things like that, we thought it would be cool to kind of dive deep into a specific person
Okay.
and the vocabulary and the things that they said and taught.
I like it.
Yeah. So
I'm excited.
yeah. So who better to pick than Steve Jobs, right?
Steve Jobs, what an icon, such a visionary, someone who really did, you know, reshape the way we think about so many things about creativity, about technology, about even just, life itself.
I think it's amazing too that we're gonna learn about him and at the same time learn some new English.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like a two-for-one deal.
Yeah. So where should we start? I mean, everyone knows about Steve Jobs.
Well, maybe not everyone knows everything about him. I mean,
Yeah.
most people don't realize that he was actually adopted, shortly after he was born in San Francisco.
Yeah, I did not know that.
Yeah, his biological parents, they were both pretty young,
Yeah.
and they felt like they weren't in a position to give him the life that he deserved.
Wow.
So they made the incredibly difficult decision to put him up for adoption.
I bet that really had an impact on him.
Oh, I'm sure it did. Early experiences like that, especially something as profound as adoption, they tend to shape who you become.
That's a good point. And, he died so young, too, right? I mean, pancreatic cancer?
Yeah, just 56 years old. It's hard to believe that he accomplished so much in such a short time.
Yeah.
When you think about all the products, all the innovations that he brought to the world, it's just mind-blowing.
I mean, Apple started in a garage, right? I mean, talk about humble beginning.
Yeah, just him and Steve Wozniak tinkering away. Not a lot of money, just this incredible passion and drive. And look what they built. I mean, it just shows you that you don't need a ton of resources to start something truly amazing.
So true. And I think a lot of people think of his successes like this straight line, just up and up and up.
Right.
But it wasn't like that at all.
Not at all. I mean, there were huge setbacks along the way. One of the biggest being when he got fired from Apple. Yeah, the very company he co-founded. He was ousted in 1985.
Wow, that must have been devastating.
I can't even imagine. But here's the thing. Instead of letting that defeat him, he went on to start two other incredibly successful companies, Pixar and NXT.
Oh, wow.
And then eventually he made this incredible comeback and returned to Apple in 1997.
And of course, that's when we saw, like the iMac, the iPod, the iPhone, the iPad, all of these groundbreaking products.
Exactly. He totally revolutionized the tech industry and our relationship with technology in general. I mean, think about how much our lives have changed because of the products that he envisioned.
So true.
And to really understand his mindset, his philosophy, I think it's incredibly valuable to look at one of his most famous speeches, the one he gave at the Stanford commencement ceremony in 2005.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that speech.
It's full of profound life lessons and also some really interesting language that we can learn from.
That's what we're going to do today, right?
That's exactly right. We're going to take some key quotes from that speech, break down the vocabulary and grammar, and give you some real-life examples of how to use those words and structures in your own English.
All right, I like it. Let's do it.
Okay, so let's start with this quote. My biological mother found out later that my mother had never graduated from college and that my father had never graduated from high school. She refused to sign the final adoption papers. She only relented a few months later when my parents promised that I would go to college.
Relented. That's an interesting word.
Yeah, it's not one we hear every day, so what do you think it means just based on the context?
Well, it sounds like his biological mom, was really against the adoption at first.
Right.
Then something changed her mind.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what relented means. It means to finally agree to something after initially refusing.
Oh, okay. So it was the promise of college that made her relent.
It seems that way. Yeah,
Yeah,
it was
but-
clearly very important to her that he receives a good education.
So can you give me like an example of how you might use relented in a regular sentence?
Sure, imagine this. My dad wouldn't let me go to the concert with my friends. He thought it was too late and too far away. But after I promised to be home by a certain time and to call him when I got there, he finally relented.
Oh, okay. So it's like he was tricked at first, but then he gave in.
Exactly. Or how about this? At first, my boss wouldn't approve my vacation request. He said it was a busy time for the company. But after I explained that it was for my sister's wedding and that I'd already booked the flights, he relented and said, okay.
Ah, I see. So it's like that feeling of giving in after, being really firm about something.
Precisely. And have you ever been in a situation where you had to convince someone to relent? Maybe you had to negotiate with a salesperson to get a better price or persuade your friend to try a new restaurant.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, sometimes you really have to work to get someone to change their mind.
That's right. And knowing how to use the word relented can help you describe those situations more effectively in English.
Okay, so what's the next word we're looking at?
All right, well, let's move on to this quote. 17 years later, I did go to college, but I naively chose a college that was almost as expensive as Stanford, and all of my working-class parents' savings were being spent on my college tuition.
Okay, so I think I know what naively means, but help me out.
Okay, so naively means to do something without having enough knowledge or experience or without really understanding the potential consequences.
So he's saying that he didn't really understand how extensive college would be?
Right, he was young, and he didn't fully grasp the financial burden it would place on his parents.
I can relate to that. I think a lot of people have those kind of naive moments in their youth.
Absolutely, like that time you decided to dye your own hair,
Yeah.
and it ended up looking like a complete disaster.
Oh gosh, don't remind me. I was so naive back then. I thought I could just follow the instructions on the box and it would turn out perfect.
Or that time you decided to bake a cake from scratch without ever having baked anything before.
Oh man, that was a mess too. The cake was like a brick.
Yeah, those are classic examples of naivete. We all have those stories.
Have you ever invested in something without really understanding the risks?
Oh yeah, definitely. I thought it was a sure thing, but it turned out to be a huge mistake. I was so naive.
That's the thing about naivete. It's often only in hindsight that we realize how much we didn't know.
Exactly. It's a learning experience for sure.
So we've talked about relented and naively. What's next?
All right, let's take a look at this quote. But then our visions of the future began to diverge, and eventually we had a falling out.
Mm.
When we did, our board of directors sided with him. And so at 30, I was out. And very publicly out. What had been the focus of my entire adult life was gone, and it was devastating.
Devastating. That's a really strong word.
It is, and it's appropriate here because he's talking about one of the most difficult periods of his life being forced out of Apple.
I mean, that's the company he built from the ground up.
Exactly, and to have it taken away from him like that so publicly, it must have been absolutely crushing.
What does devastating really mean, though?
It means something that causes a huge amount of sadness or destruction. It's like a knockout punch, an emotional blow that leaves you reeling.
I guess it's like when you lose someone you love.
Absolutely. That's a perfect example of something that could be described as devastating, or imagine losing your home in a fire or a natural disaster.
Or even something like getting a really bad injury that prevents you from doing something you're passionate about.
Exactly. All of those situations could be described as devastating because they have such a profound impact on your life.
It's interesting because the word devastating really captures the emotional weight of what he went through.
Absolutely. And everyone can relate to that feeling of loss or disappointment on some level. Maybe not to the same extent as being fired from Apple, but we've all had our share of setbacks and challenges.
So true. So how about we switch gears a little bit and talk about some grammar?
Sounds good.
There was a part in the speech where he said, I had been rejected, but something slowly began to dawn on me. I still loved what I did. The turn of events at Apple had not changed that one bit.
Ah, yes, that's a great example of the past perfect tense.
Okay, so break that down for me.
Sure. So the past perfect tense is used to talk about something that happened before another event in the past.
Okay.
In this case, he's saying, I had been rejected, meaning that the rejection happened before he realized that he still loved his work.
So the past perfect is like setting the stage for the past.
Exactly. It helps us understand the order of events.
And how do you actually form the past perfect?
It's pretty simple. You use had plus the past participle of the verb. So in this case, the past participle of reject is rejected.
Yeah.
So it becomes had been rejected.
Okay, that makes sense. Can you give me another example?
Sure. How about this? By the time I arrived at the station, the train had already left.
Ah, so had left happened before you arrived.
Exactly. Or I had already finished my homework when my friends invited me to the movies.
So you finished your homework before the invitation.
Right. So the past perfect helps us create a clear timeline of past events.
This is great stuff, and I think it's so cool how we can learn all this just from one speech by Steve Jobs.
I know, right? It's a testament to how powerful language can be.
So to wrap things up, we've learned about some great vocabulary: relented, naively, devastating.
And we've also explored the past perfect tense.
It's amazing how much we can learn from just one speech.
It is, and I hope that by understanding these words and this grammar point, you'll feel more confident in using them in your own English.
I think the biggest takeaway for me is that even someone as successful as Steve Jobs faced rejection and setbacks.
Absolutely. He had his share of struggles and disappointments.
But he never gave up on his passion.
Right. He found a way to turn those negative experiences into something positive.
And I think that's a really inspiring message for all of us. No matter what challenges we face, we can always choose to keep moving forward. Keep learning, keep growing.
So true, and maybe that's something for everyone listening to think about. Have there been times in your life when you felt rejected or defeated? How did you respond to those challenges? And what lessons did you learn along the way? Sometimes those difficult experiences can actually lead us to our greatest triumphs.
That's a great point to end on.
I think so.
Thanks for joining me on this deep dive today.
It was my pleasure.
Until next time.
See ya.
Bye.